Hi. Welcome to I Know, a solo Beatles podcast where we talk all things solo Beatles related. We are open tonight to talk about, and we are talking with a really special guest, and I am honored to be with him, Mr. Laurence Juber. Laurence, welcome to I Know.
Well, happy to be here.
So, you're he's a Grammy winning guitar player, the ex guitar player for Wings. Lawrence, what were your earliest influences with guitar for guitar players?
Well, when I first started, I mean, the most popular guitar group in England was the Shadows,
Oh, nice.
who were not only Cliff Richard's backing group, but also had hits on their own. And in fact, I mean, you can measure the influence on their influence on the Beatles at the first bona fide composition was actually John Lennon and George Harrison composition is an instrumental called "Cry for a Shadow,"
Yeah.
um, and so the Shadows were important. Um, the Beatles were important, but you got to understand. 1963, I started November '63 playing on my 11th birthday, and that year and subsequently, I mean, there was just a massive amount of music coming out of England. You know, in '63, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Dave Clark Five, the Kinks, and then as time went on, um, you have Eric Clapton starts to emerge, and all of this really was just kind of just it was like I was just kind of swimming in this ocean of guitaristic inspiration. So those were important influences. But also, once I discovered Django Reinhardt and the jazz end of the spectrum, players like Barney Kessel and Howard Roberts, Joe Pass. Because you have to understand, by the time I got to age 13, I realized that I wanted to make my living as a professional guitar player. So my sights, my musical horizons were very broad. So I was listening to a lot of different styles of guitar playing. Also, the folk guitar players, the early Bob Dylan, Paul Simon. In England, we had a group called the Pentangle, which was Bert Jansch and John Remborn, who really came out of the folk scene. But folk guitar had kind of blues and jazz influences in there too. Mostly, there was a guitar player named Davy Graham, who was kind of the first of the post-war British major acoustic fingerstyle guitar figures.
Yeah.
And I was just fascinated by that kind of self-sufficiency of being able to play guitar without any kind of accompaniment, just creating the bass parts and the melody and everything else yourself. So a lot of influences, but the Beatles were very important because you couldn't get away from them, for one thing.
um, what is your favorite Beatles record? Just out of curiosity.
I mean, in terms of albums,
Yes.
Rubber Soul always resonates with me, but it's very difficult. I mean, every time I hear a Beatle record, or just a single or whatever, I hear something that I've never heard before. So in that moment, that becomes kind of my favorite. But I think between Rubber Soul and Abbey Road, those are those are important albums for me. But at the same time, I mean, the first LP, vinyl LP that I bought was what we had in England was With the Beatles.
Oh, wow.
We didn't have Meet the Beatles, we had With the Beatles, which was a different track listing.
Yeah. And I'm guessing you gravitated towards the UK version of Rubber Soul.
Oh, of course. I didn't even know
Yeah.
about any of the American releases until I got to the States.
When
I was not aware, and the UK version of Rubber Soul lives up to the title, which the American
right.
version doesn't, because the R&B influences are baked into the UK version, but you don't
Yeah.
hear those. The American version was really slanted more towards being a folk rock record.
Yeah, which I love both of those albums,
Hmm.
but
It's just different experiences.
yeah. So I want to talk about a little bit about your work as a session musician with Rosemary Clooney. Um, Marvin Hamlet, Alan
Uh-huh.
Parsons, Carly Simon.
Well,
What was that like?
you got to go back to the mid 1970s. I went to London University and got a degree in music. I never
Oh wow.
formally studied guitar except for having some classical guitar lessons, and that was really designed to get me up to a grade level that I could study music, because that was really my academic passion, was to study music and musicology, because I was doing okay teaching myself how to play guitar and I was making money doing it.
Oh wow.
But once I left college, I had been playing with the National Youth Jazz Orchestra, which was kind of like a farm team for studio work. And I got spotted by a contractor who booked musicians for sessions. So I started working straight out of college. I started doing studio work. And um, in the nature of that world, it was, I'd work with people from very different kinds of genres. And for one reason or another, I worked with, like, Cleo Lane was one of the first records I worked on, which was produced by George Martin. So I am, like, fresh out of college, wet behind the ears, and I'm working with the Beatles producer, which was an experience.
I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure you were probably nervous meeting him for
Oh
the
yeah, of
first
course.
time.
Yeah. But as a professional, you kind of put that to one side and you do the gig.
Right.
The So that led on to, I mean, Rosemary Clooney was a really interesting one. I worked a lot with a producer named Del Newman, who took over doing, on the early Elton John records. Paul Buckmaster did all the orchestration. Del Newman took over from Paul Buckmaster. So he was very much into kind of creating music that wasn't just kind of like, chart level music, but was also had emotional content and was geared to a different kind of audience. And I worked with Charles Aznavour, who on an album, we did an album in Paris in 1977 that I learned from my own Wikipedia page. I had no idea, was #1 in France for almost the entire year of 1978. But I did a lot of studio work that I didn't always know who I was working with. One session in particular was at Abbey Road on a Tuesday night with a string orchestra and some mandolins and acoustic guitar and harpsichord. Turned out, I read in a magazine 25 years later, it was for the Alan Parsons Project, Tales of Mystery and Imagination. It's really, in that world, you don't always know what you're doing. But with Marvin Hamlisch, I worked on the score of The Spy Who Loved Me. And that was important because when I first started playing was right around the time that the Dr. No, the first James Bond movie, came out. And that sound, that twangy James Bond guitar sound, was like a very inspiring thing to get to do that on the album, on the movie score and the album. That was quite a treat.
Yeah. So fast forward, so that was 1977. So when did you first meet Paul McCartney?
Actually, that same year,
Oh, really?
I was working on an advertising jingle session at a studio in North London. And on our break, I went to the men's room with the bass player, Herbie Flowers, who's one of the great studio bass players in England, and walked into the men's room, and there's Paul McCartney zipping up his fly. I mean, literally, that was a very inauspicious meeting.
Yeah.
But shortly after that, I was playing lead guitar on a TV show with David Essex, who was a big pop star at the time. His song Rock On still gets played. And Denny Lane from Wings was a guest on the show. And we did Go Now, the old Moody Blues hit, which was kind of his signature song. And he liked my playing and recommended me to Paul and Linda. Although it took, that was September of 77. I got the call to audition in April 78. So it was, some months in between.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, the Good Night Tonight and Daytime Nighttime Suffering single was released before Back to the Egg came out.
Um, Shortly before. I mean, there were, while we were recording Back to the Egg in January of 79, we were all set up to be mixing the album because all the recording was essentially done. There were a few overdubs to do, but essentially the bulk of the recording was done. And we couldn't get into Abbey Road because Cliff Richard had booked it. And I think Kate Bush was coming in after that. And so Paul decided that as we didn't need a big studio, that he would recreate the control room of Abbey Road Studio 2 in the basement of his office in Soho Square in London. So he called it Replica Studio. And you walked in there and it was just like the control room, and there was a big picture of the studio itself with like a little clock, working clock in the middle of it. And it kind of gave you at least a sense that you were still at Abbey Road. And we had a meeting on a Friday to discuss the fact that we needed a single. And the outcome of that was that Monday morning, Paul walked into the studio with Daytime, Nighttime Suffering and said, I want to record this today. So the drums got set up in this little kitchenette area, and we had, it was like really just a little lobby for everybody to be in, where we were separated from the control room. And so we cut that track then, worked on that during the course of that week, along with doing some overdubs on Good Night Tonight, which was already an existing track. And as it turned out, Good Night Tonight became the single, and Daytime Nighttime is the B-side. But Paul insisted that he didn't want that to be on the album. He didn't want it on Back to the Egg because in his philosophy, the idea was to give value for money to the fans and not put out a single and then put the same thing on the album.
Right.
Which was, I think, frustrating to Columbia Records, because this was his first album for that label, and they had a hit record. They had a top 10 hit with Good Night Tonight, but Paul wouldn't put it on the album.
Yeah, and I think that, unfortunately, which this is my favorite Wings album, actually.
Well, you and many other people, it seems.
And I think that it would have been yeah, but I mean, I don't know if it would fit on the album, but it's just all great songs all the way through.
Well, it's certainly it's an interesting record. The critics didn't much like it when it came out, but in the course of time, it's actually gained esteem amongst the critics. And now, for example, my daughter Ilse is a songwriter, and she's walked into writing sessions and found people listening to that album.
Oh, really?
And not knowing that they wouldn't know that she's my daughter. They didn't know the connection. And especially Arrow Through Me. Erykah Badu actually used the intro to Arrow Through Me as a loop on a record. And Ilse wrote a song called Treat People with Kindness for Harry Styles, which I played on too.
Oh, wow.
And Harry Styles being a big Wings fan, but particularly a fan of that album. So, it kind of completes the circle, as it were.
Yeah. What are like the highlights of this record for you?
The highlights. Well, certainly the first batch of tunes that we recorded were To You, Spin It On, and Old Siam Sir. Those were I think the first three. And of those three, To You was the weirdest. We had come from, shortly before we went up to Scotland to start kind of coalescing as a band, we had recorded a song called Same Time Next Year, which was a demo for a movie. And as it turned out, Marvin Hamlish got the score and not Paul, so that never got released at the time. But that was like a big kind of My Love type ballad with a big string section on it. And it was, it was what you'd kind of expect from Wings. And then To You was totally not. It was this weird kind of somewhat punky thing with Paul. Paul was playing an acoustic bass guitar, and he and I collaborated on doing this weird guitar solo where I would play and he would manipulate what I was doing in real time on an Eventide harmonizer, which was a pitch shifting device. And then Spin It On, which was really like punk rockabilly. And that one I think is one of my favorites because I'll never forget when I did the solo on that, I was sitting like eye to eye with Paul with my guitar, sitting in the control room and just kind of, just going for it and getting a lot of encouragement from him. And that was kind of where I really started to understand what his capabilities as a record producer were. The way that he could bring stuff out of a performer that would, because he got more out of me than I thought that I could deliver, which was, I think, an important lesson for me. And then, doing Old Siamso was just great fun because Paul and I both played guitar on, that guitar lick, that opening riff.
It's one of his best guitar licks, I think.
It's a cool one, yeah. And then, there are a lot of moments on that album that I enjoy. Obviously, doing the Rockestra session was something notable, because the energy of having 3 drummers and 5 guitar players and 3 bass players and all of that, and especially, I mentioned the Shadows earlier. The lead guitarist from the Shadows, Hank Marvin, was standing next to me during the Rockestra session. So, and then next to him was Dave Gilmour, Jenny Lane, and Pete Townsend. And for me, it was, these were people that I grew up kind of, being inspired by. And there I am, as part of the guitar section with them.
Yeah, I'm sure it was like, oh my gosh, I'm meeting all these people and I'm going to be playing on a track.
Just, and John Bonham sits down at the drums and it sounded like somebody was driving a truck through the studio. It was so loud.
I know.
There's a level of inspiration that comes from that. The fan part, you can't let the fan part intimidate you on the playing side. One has to be very much kind of still in the professional mode.
Right. But just great sessions, all the way through. Is there a lot of unreleased material for this album?
No, there's not a lot of unreleased material. There was a song called Cage, which didn't make the cut. It's on the bootlegs. And then there's a tune of mine called Maisie, which is just a little kind of finger-picking instrumental.
Nice.
Other than that, there's nothing that I can think of. During the sessions in Scotland in July of '78, we spent a day recording a whole bunch of demos for the Rupert the Bear project, which have never been released to this day. There's some thought that when the Back to the Egg box set comes out, that would be included in that.
I think this year is what I've heard in the Beetle community. That's going to be his next, combined with London.
Well, one would think so, but it's like I'm always the last to hear.
Yeah, because last year we got Flaming Pie out of the blue.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is
I think that particular period for Paul was a difficult one.
Yeah,
because it was clear that this was, it became clear that this was going to be kind of the last Wings album.
Yeah.
Certainly by the time we got to the Tug of War period and George Martin comes in and says he doesn't want it to be a Wings album. He wants to be able to pick and choose who plays on it. And Paul was in agreement with that. And Linda had kind of lost her enthusiasm for it because now she has 4 kids. They want to keep the kids in school. They don't want to go off on world tours. And they did, after the Japanese bust, they didn't tour again until 1989. So there was really no reason to have a band anymore.
I know, which is unfortunate.
Which was a shame because we as a band were just establishing our identity. And I think what epitomizes it is the dichotomy between the coming up version on McCartney 2, on the McCartney 2 album, and the live version, which ended up as the B-side, and then got flipped because the radio didn't want to play his studio version. They loved the live version, because anytime that you have Paul McCartney singing rock and roll, there's going to be excitement about that. And so there we are, you know, in the summer of 1980, I'm sorry, summer of 1980, with a #1 record in America and no touring plans.
Right.
And so by early 1981, in January of 81, I had made the decision to move to New York. And Wings was still working at that point. We were kind of finishing up some of the outtakes, songs like Same Time Next Year actually got a remix at that point. A Love for You. I remember putting some guitar on that, and that ended up some years later in a movie. But Wings was, you know, basically Wings didn't officially fold until April of 81. But I was already in New York at that point.
Yeah. That's like one of the things is like, I think that Wings was not just Paul. I think it was a band. Which I think a lot has been like a disagreement upon some bands. Like the Wings albums would have not been Wings without Denny Lane and you and everybody else and Linda. I really don't think.
Well, I think Linda was a very important part of it, because she had a very evolved rock and roll sensibility. So she would kind of, on occasion, pull Paul away from his natural kind of pop sensibility into something a little bit more rock and roll. And she was certainly very integral to the vocal sound of the band.
Yeah.
That sound of her, Paul, and Denny together. But I think that the personalities of the individual musicians did make a difference. I mean, Denny Sywell, for example, came from a jazz and studio background versus Joe English, who was more of an American-style rock drummer, and then Steve Holley, who was much more of a big, you know, heavy backbeat English rock drummer. And each one of them brought a different stylistic sensibility.
Right.
I got the gig because I was versatile. I mean, you know, it was pretty tough stepping into the shoes of Henry McCulloch and Jimmy McCulloch, given their rock credentials. But what Paul needed at that particular time was somebody who could play rock and roll, but also do the other stuff too.
Right.
You know, so I could go from doing, you know, the kind of the crazy rockabilly stuff on Spin It On to the jazzy stuff on Baby's Request, for example. Just really, or the flamenco style acoustic lead on Goodnight Tonight. It was just all part of what I did. So I think that I was able to bring my musical personality, as Steve Holley did in our version of the band. And I think that, you know, and Denny was always kind of the core of the band. So his version of this kind of, on one hand, R&B and on the other hand, kind of English folk kind of fusion, which is very much part of his kind of stylistic sensibility, I think all work together. By the way, did you freeze?
Yeah.
Yeah, your video froze.
Oh, here, maybe.
I'm still hearing you, so as long as you've got me. There you are, we're back.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, we were encouraged to think of it as a band and not just as Paul's backing group. But there was always that pull between Paul as the creative focus and then the band bringing their particular sensibilities to that. So at the end of the day, it was still, it was still Paul calling the shots, but we did get to make creative contributions that were outside of his core creative focus.
Right. Um, and the Rockrister sessions, like, how did that take a lot of different takes to get that just right, or was it kind of
Well,
just
I mean, the hardest part of that was technical. That was the first time I'd seen two 24-track machines synced up. Because we needed that many tracks, because there were so many musicians. I mean, 3 drum kits would be enough to fill a 24-track tape right there. Um, I don't recall that it was particularly laborious. I mean, we ran the tune, everybody learned it. We probably did 3 or 4 takes before we got the one we were happy with. Essentially, it was a 3-hour session, and we did 2 tunes. We did So Glad to See You Here Too. So it was not a particularly lengthy process. It was just chaos in the control room because there were so many engineers and second engineers and technicians all making sure that everything was working smoothly. Plus, we had a camera crew there too.
yeah. And then the Back to the Egg TV special, which I think is really great. Do you remember like recording all of that and stuff?
Well, we filmed that that was all done. We had recorded at a place called Lim Castle, which was on the south coast of England. And the location, I think, more than anything else, was just relatively close to where Paul and Linda were living in Peasmarsh, because they'd moved out of London with the kids. The kids were now going to a local school, and they didn't want to have to commute in and out of London every day. So they'd found this medieval castle, and that was where we recorded in September of '78. We recorded a number of the Back to the Egg tracks. And then we went back there to do the videos for the Back to the Egg special. So all of the album tracks were recorded there. The Good Night Tonight video was done at the Hammersmith Palais, which was a dance hall in London. In fact, that picture over there was from that session.
Oh, wow.
And that had a revolving stage. So at the end of the video, the stage revolves. And I had played there. I used to play there at weekends with a big band that would play for people to dance to right out of college. I was while I was getting into studio work, I'd go, and because I was a good sight reader, I could just go in and read all the parts, and making money.
Yeah.
But Lim Castle was, or that area. I mean, the aircraft hangar for Spin It On was adjacent to the castle, and we went down to the beach, which wasn't very far away, for the Baby's Request video. And I think for again and again and again, we were stuck in some field somewhere. But like the Love Awake, Winter Rose stuff was done in and around the castle.
Yeah. Interesting. And then when you went on tour, like, was this like difficult to play live, kind of to get it all right when you were touring in England?
It was not difficult to get it right. I mean, we rehearsed. The songs were not that difficult. I had a fair amount of responsibility because, as well as playing electric guitar, playing lead guitar, I also had to double some of the synth lines. So I had a guitar synthesizer in a rack, or actually it was a pitch to voltage converter. And then I also had to do vocoder stuff on Good Night Tonight. So I had a microphone that I could, just put on and then play and also sing at the same time. And we built a custom pedal board for me, and I had Roland, the equipment manufacturer had started making what they called the Roland Rack, which had a preamp and a pitch to voltage converter and a Dimension D, which was an early, very cool chorus device. And I had that running through a pair of Marshall 4x12 speakers. So I could get, like on Let It Be, I could get this big kind of chorusy, quasi-Leslie sound, and then be able to switch over to my lead guitar sound on a Mesa Boogie amp. So there was a fair amount of kind of just technical organizing for a tour like that. But the material itself, I mean, once you learn the tunes, it's then just playing it for audiences and getting better at it. So by the time we got to Glasgow for the end of the tour, I think the band was really cooking. And that Last Flight bootleg is pretty representative of where the band was going. I think we would have gone further. I mean, when we got to Japan, of course, Paul got busted. So we never got a chance to add. We added Another Day, Live and Let Die. I forget what else. Oh, Let 'Em In. Those got added to the set list because all of those had been big hits in Japan.
Nice. And then you also worked with Ringo on Stop and Smell the Roses.
I did. In July of 1980, Paul called me up and said, I'm producing some tracks for Ringo. Do you want to come and play? So I said, sure. So we trooped off to the south of France to Super Bear Studio, which is where the Pink Floyd had been working on The Wall, and spent like 10 days just outside of Nice. I mean, it was kind of a vacation as much as anything else. But to be in a studio with Ringo and Paul together.
It's like, oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like whoa moment, as it were.
Was George Harrison there? Because he was also on the album.
No, George was anything with George or like Harry Nilsson produced some stuff. I think Stephen Stills produced some stuff. Ringo went to different producers. Yeah. And Paul did, we did Sure to Fall, the old Carl Perkins. We did Private Property, Attention. And then there was this jam we did called You Can't Fight Lightning, where Ringo actually played one of my guitars and cut his finger and bled inside it. And I have spots of Ringo's blood inside my guitar. So if we ever need to clone him, I have his DNA.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, that was quite an experience.
Yeah. But I mean, working with, and then after that, you went solo. What has your solo career brought to you?
Well, I mean, that was a process because when I got to New York, I got back into doing studio work. I was working on some band projects, but the studio work came very quickly. But then I met Hope, who became my wife, and she was from LA. And I moved to LA in October of 1981. We got married the following March. And it took me about 6 months or so to really start getting into studio work here. And because we started raising a family, I didn't want to tour. So I had turned down a few potential band offers. And then once I got into studio work, that really kind of moved very quickly, and I ended up doing a lot of work in TV and movies and records, really up until about 5 years ago when I had, in 1990, I put out a solo acoustic guitar record, which actually got some radio airplay, and I got a lot of encouragement to do more. So I kept doing it, and I think I've done like about 30 at this point.
Oh, wow. I mean, the Beatles instrumental ones are the ones
that four albums of Beatle instrumentals.
Which are beautiful.
Well, thank you. But that was never my intention.
Oh, really?
When I started doing solo records, I was doing it as a composer, as an artist. And so my first batch of albums were all original material. Wasn't until Hope, my wife, said, people keep asking you for a Beatle album, and I kept saying no. And she said, well, if you don't do it for anybody else, do it for me. So I said, well, okay, well, you can produce it, and then I'll do it. So she did, and that was very well received. And then after Paul gave it to Paul, and he said, well, what about Wings? so, so I did one wing, which was, a bunch of post Beatles, McCartney. And then I did another one because people kept asking for more, and it just kind of ended up I've done four. And Hope keeps trying to talk me into doing another one. And I actually, at this point, I probably have enough arrangements that haven't been recorded to do another one, but I've got a lot of other things on my agenda.
Yeah. When did the first one come out?
2000.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So
That's 21 years ago now.
yeah. So it's gone by quick.
Yeah, and then 1995, I started working with Al Stewart and produced four albums for him, produced, arranged, played on, recorded, and did some touring with him as a duo.
Oh, nice.
So I would open the show acoustically on my own, and then we'd play two acoustic guitars together. And we did touring with that, and as I say, like recorded four albums. And then my own activities just kind of got to the point where I didn't have time to work with Al anymore, and then I started touring more extensively. I got up to the point where I was doing about 100 shows a year, and then that got to be more than I really wanted. So I kind of told my agent to, less is more. And then, I was doing that right up until COVID shut everything down. And then since then, I've been doing Facebook Live 3 times a week.
Yeah, I've watched some of the recaps on YouTube, and it's wonderful. You're just so talented.
Well, thank you.
It
takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, I play a little bit of guitar, so
well, good for you.
thank you. And I know you've been going to Beetle Fest.
Mm-hmm.
What is that experience meeting fans like?
Well, I mean, there's such a fan base, and it's really the Beatle world is really quite a community, and it's an ideal audience for me to be playing my Beatle arrangements to, and it's fun to be part of a celebration of the band, and I realized, some years ago that this was never going to go away. It's not like some bands just kind of, the era is gone and they become kind of, Wikipedia footnotes, as it were.
Yeah.
But being Beatles adjacent is kind of, a different level. But the fact is that, my period with Wings was really just a small part of my career, an important part, an influential part, and certainly, good on my resume. But, having, put out as many albums as I had, played on some very big movies and records. I mean, Dirty Dancing, Good Will Hunting, Pocahontas, TV shows like Home Improvement, Roseanne, Seventh Heaven, a lot of stuff, and I'm still learning about things I played on. I mean, one time, I think 1977, I played on a record for an Italian artist named Lucio Battisti. I had no idea he was like Elvis in Italy, and I still get emails from Italian fans wanting to know about that kind of stuff. So it's a being a professional musician is, puts you in interesting places. But my primary thing was always to be a guitar player.
Yeah.
But I also understood as time went on that my skill set was that of an arranger and a composer and a producer. And I just learned so much over the years from working in studios and working with artists as to how records actually get made.
Yeah.
And how the business of it works. And it's just been, it's been quite a journey, really. Not sure where it's going next. I know that I'm playing a lot more electric guitar these days.
Oh, wow. And
Um,
what's your favorite guitar to play?
right now,
Yes.
my favorite electric, which was just handed to me last week, is the Paul Reed Smith,
Oh, nice.
and not plugged in, but it's a hollow body with an acoustic guitar pickup built into the bridge, so I can blend the electric and the acoustic aspects of it.
Beautiful.
My my signature model guitar is this, which is a Martin. And that's an orchestra, what they call an orchestra model.
Oh, wow.
And this one is Cuban mahogany
Oh, wow. That's
with a
beautiful.
high alpine Swiss spruce top. Over the years, I put a lot of thought and research into finding the right wood combination and the just the right dimensions and everything for me to do what works for me as a guitar soloist. So that particular guitar is the kind of the latest incarnation of it, and probably the final one too. I don't know that it can go any further.
Do you remember what guitar you used in Wings for
Yeah, I
performance?
still have. I used an SG, which I still have. In one of the cases over there is the 335 that you see in the Good Night Tonight video.
Oh, wow.
Number of those guitars are I've traded or sold because I just, it's always kind of moving forward. I do have the Les Paul Gold Top that I got in New York on the way to Japan, but that didn't get used on any Wings records. That was actually going to get used for the Japanese tour.
Bennett, you never got it back, right?
What's that?
Did you ever get that guitar back?
Oh yeah, no, it's always been with me.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, no, I had it. I was hand carrying it from New York to Tokyo, and then when Paul got busted, the customs people came into the room with a screwdriver and pointed to the guitar, and I had to unscrew the back panels and
I
show
bet
there was
that was
nothing stashed in there.
I bet that was a pain to put back together.
No, it wasn't so bad. You just unscrew the panels, and it was just I wasn't sure what they had in mind.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on I Know, I Know. Is there anything you would like to plug?
Just check my Facebook artist page. That's where I do my Facebook live sessions. And if you're not on Facebook, YouTube, I do occasionally put excerpts from those tea times onto YouTube. And my website is laurencejuber.com. I'm very Googleable. You can find me.
I'll link in
And
the
my
description.
book, I don't have a copy handy, but my book, Guitar with Wings, has all of my pictures, including, you might not see it very clearly, but there's a picture of Paul with a squeeze box up there
Oh,
next
wow.
to the platinum record. That's when we were recording How Many Million Miles. So there are pictures from the Rockestra session. There's the story of my career, but also a lot of granular detail about recording the Back to the Egg album. So and then, I'm on the streaming services, so Apple Music, Spotify, Pandora. Seems like on Pandora, it's my old Christmas music that gets most of the play. But Spotify, because a few years ago, I scored a video game called Diablo 3. So my top tracks on Spotify are the Diablo 3 stuff. But my own work gets played too. But there's and the album, I recorded an album in 1979 that Paul asked me to take stuff out of his publishing catalog. There's an album called Standard Time, which has Maisie, which is that Back to the Egg outtake That's on that album.
Oh, interesting.
So, the fact that the first tune that I wrote, I got Paul McCartney to play bass on is, I think, pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Laurence.
Well, you're very welcome, and
Awesome.
good luck with your podcast.